in this video I'm going to show you how the engine of a Suzuki SV650 works. I'm also going to disassemble this engine and strip it down to its bare bones and show you all the different components and explain how they work. This engine is referred to as a V-twin engine, and the reason for that, as you can see, is because it has two cylinders, number one at the front and this is number two, and as you can see they're in a V shape. There's actually a 90-degree angle between the two cylinders. This position is how the engine actually sits when it's installed in the motorcycle. So let's look around the components on the outside of the engine. First of all, we have the valve cover on cylinder number 1, valve cover on cylinder number 2. Here we have cylinder number 1, cylinder number 2. This is the left hand side of the motorcycle engine. This is the alternator cover. Underneath here is the stator and rotor, which generates the power, or the electrical power, that runs the motorcycle and recharges the battery. We also have, on this side, we have the output shaft, which is this shaft here. Your front sprocket connects on here, and that's what drives the rear wheel of the motorcycle. We have our gear change shaft here. Usually there will be this will be connected to the gear change lever, which is at your left foot. Down here we have the neutral or gear indicator switch, which is connected up through this wire here. You can also see that we have the oil filter is at the front of the engine. Also on view you can see the cam chain tensioner on cylinder number 1 is here, and then we have a cam chain tensioner on cylinder number 2 at the rear. The engine identification number here is labelled here on this side, on the left hand side of the engine. And lastly, on the left hand side we have the push rod, which acts on the clutch. So this goes through here and it connects to the clutch on the right hand side of the engine. You can also see here that we have the intake ports for the cylinder number 2 here, and then we have the intake port for cylinder number 1 here. The exhaust ports are here, so they're just at the front of the motorcycle, some carbon dropping out there, and then we have an exhaust port just here on cylinder number 2. Spark plugs are located at the top, just in the middle of the valve covers, and in the middle of the valve cover here as well. So that's our spark plugs. And then lastly we can see that the oil drain bolt is here. So that's the oil drain bolt for draining the oil when you want to change it on the motorcycle engine. So let's turn the engine around and look at the other side. So on the other side of the engine we can see a number of components. First of all, we have our clutch cover, we have our oil filler cap, which is here. Clutch cover, our clutch is underneath this cover. We have our oil sight glass, our oil level sight glass is just here. We have our starter motor, which is down at underneath the front cylinder. We also have our water pump here. So this component here is the water pump, and down here we have the oil pressure switch. Now these two, you can see two little hose pipes that are coming off both cylinders in the middle. They are the little coolant hoses, so they connect into the cooling system, which is getting pumped around, or the coolant that's getting pumped around by the coolant pump here. Okay, so let's start off this assembly by removing some of the cables and hoses that are just in the way. So the first one I'm going to remove is the gear indicator switch, or the neutral indicator switch. So it's just held on with two little screws. Just remove those. So this is the little switch that indicates which gear the engine is in, or whether the transmission is in neutral or not. So there's a little, what you can see is here, there's a little ball, and on the switch here, on this side, you'll see that there is some little, I suppose they're little sensors, okay, and they're connected up to the electrical system, and as you change the gear, the little ball, which is on, I think, the end of the transmission is going to rotate. As you go up the gears or down the gears, it's going to rotate, and that little ball is going to go with it. And as that ball moves, it moves into a different position, so it activates a different circuit. And that's how it indicates the gear that the transmission is in, or indicates whether it's in neutral or not. So I'm just going to remove that. It just comes off like so. That's that. The next thing I'm going to remove is this little pipe, which is connected between the two cylinders of the engine. Or actually, this is actually one side. It's connected to the crankcase. So this is the crankcase breather tube, and it's just for recycling some of the unburnt gases that make their way into the crankcase of the engine. So that's out of the way. This cable here, this wire, is connected into the alternator, so I can't remove that for the moment, so I have to leave that as is. So when disassembling this particular engine, it's recommended that you work your way from the top downwards. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the spark plugs from both cylinders. That will allow me to turn the engine manually a little bit easier. If you leave the spark plugs in, it creates a little bit of pressure. So I'm just going to remove the spark plugs. Okay. There's my first spark plug. Now to remove my second spark plug. There's my second spark plug. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the valve cover. So that underneath the valve cover we should find the camshaft and the valves. So these little bolts should not be too tight. They should be quite loose actually. So there's just 3 bolts holding on the cover, and I take off the cover. It should come with a little black rubber gasket. So to properly show you the camshaft and the cam chain working, I'm going to remove this little crankshaft cover, which is in the alternator. So it's just a little cover, metal cover with a little rubber seal to keep in the oil. That can be removed. And I can take a 17 socket, and on the end I can see here the end of the crankshaft, and on the end of the crankshaft is a bolt, and I can actually rotate this bolt counterclockwise. Okay, so as I rotate the crankshaft, it's rotating the pistons, but it's also acting on the cam chain. So this cam chain is connected to the crankshaft down here, so it goes through the cylinder, it's connected to the gears in the crankshaft, and as the camshaft or the crankshaft is rotating, it acts on these cam chains, and there's one in either cylinder, and the cam chains act on the camshaft. So the reason that the camshafts are connected to the crankshaft via this chain is just to ensure that the camshaft and the cams that are on the camshaft, that they are in sync. So the cams on the camshaft act on the valves in the cylinder, in each of the cylinders, and they open and close. They are responsible, the cams are responsible for opening and closing the valves in the cylinder. Now the crankshaft is acted on by the piston. So the piston is going up and down in the engine is what is driving the crankshaft. So before we start removing any of the camshafts, what we want to do is we want to remove this little sight cover. So this allows us, with that little cover off, it allows us to see the markings on the rotor of the engine. So we want to get it lined up to an F. So there's a little F on marking just in here, which you'll hopefully we will see when I rotate it. Just go slowly. There we go. So I can see this little F. Okay, so with that little F marking lined up with the little groove in the sighting hole, I can actually see that there is little markings on the camshafts of the engine. So on the gears here, there is little line marks, okay, and they are pointing straight, so they're parallel with the cylinder of the engine, or the head of the cylinder of the engine. Now when I look down, when I look at the little cams, they are actually pointing down. So I need to go another 360 degrees, because I need them, when they're pointing down the cams, that means that they are creating tension on the valves. So I go through another 360 degrees. Let me see, and look for my F again. Okay, just go back. There's my F again. Okay, so that F is lined up again after rotating it through 360 degrees. Now I can see that the cams are pointing up in the air on both. So these are the cams on the intake valves, and these are the cams on the exhaust valves. Okay, so now the pressure is off the valves, and now I can start taking off disassembling the cylinder. So the cam chain has to be kept under tension, because if the cam chain is loose, it's going to pop off the gear at the end of the camshaft, and that's going to destroy timings on your engine. It's going to destroy your engine. Now, to keep that chain in proper tension, there is a little cam chain tensioner which is here. So this little cam chain tensioner, it has a little cap on it. So I need a 10. So it's just a little 10mm bolt. And then I can, the cam chain tensioner is held on with two little bolts here, which I can remove. Just get them loose and just remove them. So the little cam chain tensioner is, I suppose it's on a little spring. So it's a little spring that's pushing from here into the cam chain, and it keeps it under proper tension. Not too tight and not too loose. So it's the spring motion, or the force of the spring, that's actually pushing that up. I'm not pulling that up. So I take off this bolt, and there's my little cam chain tensioner. Now, as you can see, I can't press this. And the only way that you can retract this is using a little flathead screwdriver, which inserts in here, and twisting it clockwise. And when you twist it clockwise, you can see that it retracts this. I can retract it a good bit of the way. Okay, so that's the cam chain tensioner. Right, so with the cam chain tensioner off, I can see that the cam chain is now loose. So as you can see, the cam chain is loose. Now, the other thing that keeps the cam chain moving on its paths or in place is this. There's a cam chain guide. So there's two of them. So there's one at the very top of the cylinder, and then there's a side guide, which I think it's in the cylinder. It's on one side or the other. It's inside anyway. So let's take off the one at the top. So it's just held on with two little or three little bolts, I think, which can come off quite easy. Okay. So once those three bolts come off, I can just lift that off. So the camshaft is actually held in place by these two components here, which are called the camshaft holders. Now the camshaft holders, which are these metal plates, they are secured. There's an input and an exhaust camshaft holder. Okay, now they're both secured with 6 bolts each, and to remove the camshaft holders, we can just loosen those bolts. So we loosen each of these bolts slowly, just a small amount at a time. And we start on the outside and work in a crisscross manner. Just okay, and then work our way in. Only loosen them barely. Okay. And at this stage they should all be loose enough. They shouldn't really be under tension, any of them. So we can remove the 6 bolts. I'll just screw them all out, and I'll remove the camshaft holder. And then I'll do it on the exhaust cam as well. Okay. So as you can see, the little arrow points towards the end of the camshaft, or the gear end, and it also says in here, so that means that this is for the intake cam. So there's our cam underneath. So here we have our cam, and lift off the cam chain. Okay, just lift it off like that, and off comes our camshaft. So this is the camshaft gear, and here we have the little cams. So as you can see, the little cams are an oval shape. They're not perfectly round. Let me just turn it this way, you'll see it easier. So the camshafts have they're little lobes, metal lobes. And what happens is, as they're turning, they're very close to the valve followers, which are these two things here, which are connected to the valves. And as they rotate, as this end of the lobe, the bottom end of the lobe, the thicker end, as that rotates onto the follower, it pushes down on the guide, or it pushes down on the valve, and it opens the valve. So once that's pointing downwards, the valve will be fully open, and that will allow air into the engine. So here we have the cam holder for the exhaust. Cam is off. As you can see, it says EX, which indicates that this is for the exhaust, and has a little arrow pointing on which way it should be placed back. So that's quite important. You'll also notice that there is two dowels on for each cam holder as well, so make sure that they don't get lost. And here we have the cam for the exhaust port. Again, you can see how it rotates in the top of the cylinder head, and as the little cams here, the two cam lobes, as they rotate, they push down on the valves and open up the exhaust port. Now the other thing to note is that there is these markings on the cams. So we have a marking here which says 2, we have 1F, we have an F, we have a 1R. So these markings are quite important when you're going to reinstall the cams in the engine. You need to make sure that they go back in and adjust the markings. They have to be in a correct, inserted in a correct manner, with the markings pointing in a particular direction. Okay, so that's the exhaust cam. So there we have our cam chain. As you can see, it's nice and loose. There's a little bolt here which you can sit on, so that's fine. So just let it sit there, there's no problem. So now we can see the intake valves. There's 2 intake valves in each cylinder, and then there's 2 exhaust valves. So we can take these little followers off. They're little metal caps really. Okay, so once I take the follower off, I can see that there is a little shim. Okay, so these little shims, they sit in on top of the valve, and their role is essentially to make sure that the valve clearances are set at the correct tolerance. So for the intake valves, the tolerance is between the follower and the actual cam is between 0.1 and 0.2 millimeters, and for the exhaust, the valve clearance is between 0.2 and 0.3 millimeters. So I can take all these little cam followers out and make sure that I get the shims. The shims may remain in here, and you can take them out with a little magnet. So before I remove anything else from the cylinder number 1, the front cylinder, I need to go to the rear cylinder, and I need to do the exact same. I need to go through the exact same process. I need to remove the valve cover, I need to remove the chain tensioner, I need to remove the cam holders, and remove the cams. Now to do that, the first thing you need to do is you need to rotate the engine. So the first thing I need to do is I need to remove the bolts securing the valve cover. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. It's the exact same as on the last cylinder. The reason I need to remove the valve cover is because I need to rotate the engine. So I need to get the valve cams, or the cams acting on the valves, I need them pointing away from the valves. So to do that, you rotate the engine, go back here at the alternator cover, put your 17 socket spanner on the crankshaft and rotate it anti-clockwise. Now keep a hold on this chain from the front cylinder, and you need to align an R marking with the little marking on the site here at the top of the alternator cover. So I'm just going to rotate that slowly. I need to look out for this R marking. Okay, so there's my R marking. It's lined up with a little notch. So I now check the valves. So the exhaust valves are pointing up in the air, and so are the intake valves, so we're all good. If any of the valves are still pointing downwards, rotate it through again to the R again. I think it's rotated through 360 degrees, and then you should find that all the valves are pointing upwards, or all the cams are pointing upwards. Okay, so when the cams are pointing upwards, there is no pressure on the valves. So we're now good to go ahead and remove the cam chain tensioner, which is here. It's the same as what I did here. And then I'm going to remove the cam follower, or the cam chain follower, and then I'm going to remove the camshaft holder on the intake port, and then the camshaft holder on the exhaust port, and then remove the two cams. So it's the exact same as I've just done on this one, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so there's my camshaft tensioner, or sorry, cam chain tensioner on the rear cylinder. That's out. Okay, so to remove the cylinder head, there is a number of very tight bolts that have to be removed. And then the next set of bolts that we need to remove are these three here. So we have one here, and then we have two in here. So we have one just in here, and we have one just in here. So they have to be removed. This is opened with an Allen key. These are actually very tight. These are torqued down very tightly. Okay, so I have again loosened it up. So, get it. Okay. Okay, so that's loose there now. We need to take it out for the moment. We then need a mm socket to get out the two bolts here, which again we have loosened already. So they're already loose. So two go here. These are torqued down very tightly. So you don't want those falling into your engine, so just be careful. Make sure they're fully loose. Okay, they're quite long bolts, so they're not going to go anywhere. This one, it's only going to fall outwards. So then we have 4 bolts. So these are the tightest bolts. So I needed a 12 mm to loosen these 4 bolts here. Now these 4 bolts, you need to loosen them in a crisscross manner, which I have done already. Okay, so you would loosen them 1/8 of a turn at a time. So 1/8 of a turn, not a quarter, just 1/8 of a turn, 1/8 of a turn, 1/8 of a turn, 1/8 of a turn, and then keep repeating this between 5 and 10 times until you feel the resistance come out. Okay, if you loosen these too much, you could warp your cylinder head. So just be careful. So I've already loosened these, as I mentioned. I actually had to use a breaker bar on the end of my spanner to get enough leverage to break them. You should hear a cracking sound, and that's just them coming loose because they're going to be torqued so tightly. Okay, hopefully that's it. Okay, so sometimes you might need a soft mallet just to hit it a few knocks. Doesn't seem to be needed in this case. So as you can see, they're coming apart. So this is the cylinder head. Okay, now the last thing I need to do is undo this little bolt here. So I've already loosened this, and this is the bolt that the cam chain sits on. So if you're removing this, this stops the cam chain from falling into the developer chain. Be careful now with this bolt, or with this chain. Okay. Just a little washer. So that's just my little washer that I don't want to lose. So I'll keep that with that. Now that my chain is out, I'll just put this back in. Just leave my chain there, hopefully it won't fall in. I'm just putting this back in loosely into the cylinder head. Okay, so it's in the cylinder head. Now, to remove this, I should just have to pull it up. I should be able to pull up my, so there we go. And I don't want my cam chain to fall through, so I just put my finger through it, just to catch it, and let it lie down. And there's my cylinder head off. So with the cylinder head off the engine, off the rear cylinder, we can see here our piston, which is at the top of the cylinder. It's at top dead center. So that means it's at the highest point in its travel. Okay, so you can see that it's reaching right up to the cylinder head. So this is the cylinder head that I just took off. Okay, so you can see the big long bolts that secured in. The 1, 2, 3, 4. So they're the 4 bolts that anchor it to the crankcase of the engine. Now, what you can see here, on one end we have our cam followers, which not that easy to take out, but there's one I can take out. Cam followers that we looked at earlier with the little shim inside, which is just a little metal spacer. There we see our valves. Okay, so this is what the follower and shim act on. It's just a little valve. So the valve is right in the middle, and the valve is, just put this back in. So I don't want to lose these followers or mix them up. Don't want to turn this upside down, but we can see here that this is the exhaust port. It's all covered in quite a bit of carbon, so it's unburned fuel essentially. And here we have the 2 valves, the exhaust valves. Okay, and between the valves, the exhaust valves and the cam followers, we have some springs. Okay, and here we have our air and fuel intake valves. As you can see, there's quite a bit of carbon build up on them, but they're not too bad. And then on the other side we have our air and fuel intake port, and these are the 2 cam followers for the intake valves. Okay, so then looking through, we can see where the chain lives up here. It moves in this area here, and we want to keep everything in order, so we're not going to move anything. We're not going to remove any of these bolts or cam followers. We're just going to leave it as it is. We can see here there's a little hole. This is where the spark plug, when it's screwed in, the bottom of the spark plug will just be sticking out through this little hole here into the head of the cylinder, and that's what sets the spark to fire the engine. So that's the cylinder head. I'm going to write that down. Again, here we have our cam chain, and here we have our cam guide, or cam chain guides. So we actually have 2 of them. We have this one here, which, as you can see, it just slides out like so. It's just made from a bit of, I suppose, a special type of plastic, and the chain essentially, it's like a rail. The chain slides along it when it's under tension, so it keeps the tension on the chain, I suppose. Okay, so this one is stationary, it can't move, the one on the right hand side, and then this one here, it's it's on a swivel. Okay, and so I can't take this one out. That one is kind of stuck in. So I'll have to disassemble the engine more to take out that particular cam chain follower. We should always check the condition of the cam chain follower. These ones are in good condition. No problems with them. So there's our cylinder head off. And then the next thing we can do is we can just undo these two bolts, or these two nuts. Again, these are probably the only two nuts that are holding on the cylinder. So now we should be able to take off the cylinder of the engine. So again, I don't want my chain falling into the crankcase. So let me just slowly lift it up. As you can see, it comes quite easily. Just get the cable out of the way. I'm going to lift it up slowly. There we have our chain. I'm just going to put a little metal bar through the chain so it doesn't fall in to the engine, to the crankcase. Okay, so it's going to stop catch the chain. I can just pull it off. See? There we go. Put that back in. So there we have the cylinder from the rear cylinder. Okay, just take that out for a second. So there we can see the cylinder. Okay, as you can see, it actually lives in the crankcase. This part here goes down into the crankcase. So this is the cylinder sleeve. We can check the condition of it, we can check the width of it. It's all in good condition, it looks like. Right. And then around the edge of the cylinder we can see there is this groove, or this dugout channel the whole way around. So this is where the coolant lives. So the coolant is pumped around the engine by this water pump, which is here, and the water pump pumps that coolant through different various channels and pipes in the engine, and it actually gets pumped up through around the cylinder of the engine. And the role of the coolant is just to keep the to absorb the heat that is created in the cylinder of the engine as when the engine is running, and then that coolant, which is getting pumped around the engine, is then getting pumped to the radiator of the motorcycle, which is in contact with the air, where it cools down, and then it comes back into the engine, cools down, and gets heat, goes back up through this water bath, absorbs energy from the cylinder of the engine, and then goes on to back through the, pumped out by the coolant pump, back to the radiator again. And there we have it. Let's just take that bar out. Again, here's our cam chain guide sticking up. As you can see, there's our chain, and here we can see a little bit better, we have our piston. Okay, so there's quite a bit of buildup of carbon on the piston. So again, that's unburnt fuel. The piston has a number of piston rings, and there we can see the connecting rod which connects the piston to the crankshaft. Okay. The last thing to show you here is we have a little screw. This screw is, let me just take it out with a little flathead screwdriver. This is a an oil channel. Okay, it's just a little oil jet. I have turned the engine around, so now I'm back to the front cylinder of the engine, and I'm going to go through the process again. This time I have not loosened the bolts already, so I'm just going to show you me loosening the bolts, but it's going to be the exact same process as I just did on the rear cylinder. So let's just go out. Okay, that's that loose. Okay, go back to these two bolts, remove them. Okay, I'll do the rest by hand, hopefully. Okay, now I take my 12 socket and my breaker bar, get a bit of leverage, and I do 1/8 of a turn at a time. So then go across diagonally. These are really tight. So check them all with my magnets. They're all just popping up. Yep, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And lastly, I need to open this. So this nut or bolt is it's basically just there to stop the cam chain from falling into the cylinder of the engine or down into the crankcase. So it's not going to be too tight. So it's loosened up. Again, just watching for any washers or anything. So I put the cam chain on the other side of it, so it's not going to be catching in the cam chain. And put this back in, just so I don't lose it. Okay, so now, in theory, all my bolts are loose. I should just hit this out. Okay. Don't be tempted to lever it with a screwdriver. Bit of a gasket stuck here, and that's it. Okay. Again, there is our cam chain guides. This one is removable. I'll just leave it with the one is removable. This one is not. There we can see our piston in the cylinder. What fell out here was a dowel. So stick that back in. I think that one goes there. Don't want to lose your dowels, so just keep an eye on them. There generally should be 2 for every part that comes apart. We have 4 dowels here on top of the cylinder head, and again we can see our intake port is just here, our exhaust port is here. We have our 2 valves with followers on top of them for the exhaust port, and 2 valves for the input port. And if we turn it around, there we can see the bottom of our 2 valves for the exhaust and our 2 valves for the air and fuel intake. And here's our gasket, our cylinder head gasket. So I'm going to leave everything in order. Just put that to the side again. Again, we have our coolant bath, which is around the cylinder. Again, it's just cooling down the cylinder or taking heat away. And then what we can do now is we can just remove these 2 bolts. It's better than a spanner. Okay. And this is just, these are the 2 bolts, the 2 remaining bolts that are holding on the cylinder. This one is quite tight. So actually the bolt came off itself. It's a double-ended bolt. So it's okay, it's not a big problem. one should come off just a nut. Yep. Right, just give it a little bit of a wobble. The only thing that should really be holding it on is should be some dowels. Okay, and the cylinder itself. So we pull it off. Piston is quite tight. And pull the chain down because I don't want that to get lost. Our gasket has come very loose. No matter. Okay. There's our cylinder from the front engine. What you'll notice is that they actually are labelled front so that you can't put them in back in incorrectly. There is my gasket. And again, there we have our little oil jet. So you want to be careful that you don't lose that. And then we have our two dowels there, and then we actually have two dowels on the other side as well. Get my socket on the alternator, and there we go. There we can see the crankshaft moving. So the pistons, both of them are connected to the crankshaft. And the chain is probably catching in it there somewhere. So I can't move it too much, but you get the idea. So I have just removed the piston from the front cylinder. So I've removed it from the connecting rod. So just to show you how it actually connects on, there's this little rod here, okay, and it slides through here like so, and it slides through there and connects it onto the connecting rod. Now this little shaft, it's a very tight fit. Okay, it is actually, when it's inserted the whole way back in, when it's inserted in, there is actually a little circlip, just a tiny little circlip, which actually clips in there and secures this little rod in place. Okay, and the piston can rotate on it. It's just perfectly circular and nice and smooth. And then the other thing to note is on the piston, when you take it off, there's a little dot, okay, on one side of the piston, and that little dot indicates this is the side. When you're putting it back on, you don't put it back on this way, you put it back on this way. So the little dot should be facing towards the exhaust port. It should be on the exhaust port side of the cylinder. Okay, so that's the piston from the front cylinder. Let me just put that to the side, and I'll just show you what we do to remove the piston on this on the rear cylinder. So I'm just going to rotate the engine a little just to get the piston out as much as possible. Okay, so I'm going to take a little small flathead screwdriver, and there's a little groove in the piston which you can see here, and that what I want to do is I want to push that little rod back in as far as I can so that the piston can actually move a little on the connecting rod. So there's a little bit of free play, so if you're taking out the circlip on this near side, you want to pull the piston, so don't have it over there, you need to pull it over here to me this way as much as possible, and that allows me to get at the circlip. Now, the circlip might go flying, so just be careful. So I can just get the little flathead screwdriver in here, and I can lever that little circlip. Okay, so it's coming out, so you can just see the circlip, it's starting to come out. Can't believe it finished. Damn, it's gone flying. But that's the circlip out. I'll find out in a second. Okay, so I then just get a little screwdriver and just give it a little bit of a push. It's hard to grip it, so I'm just pushing out this little rod on the far side. There we go. So that should be it out. Okay, don't need to pull it out the whole way, but that's enough to get the piston off. There's my connecting rod on the rear cylinder. And again, there's a little dot on this piston at the rear, and that indicates that this is the side that it should go for. It should be on the side of the exhaust port when it's being reinstalled. So don't get these pistons mixed up. This is the one for the rear cylinder, so I'm going to put it with all my parts for the rear cylinder. Okay, so the next thing we want to move on to is the clutch. Now the clutch is located underneath this cover. We have a number of bolts securing the clutch cover. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think 8 bolts that we need to remove. So they're not going to be on too tightly, so we can remove those. Okay, so with all those bolts loosened, the clutch cover just comes away like so. So there is our clutch cover. It's actually made from some sort of a, what looks like some sort of a plastic. So it's obviously quite lightweight and probably cheap to replace. So if you drop your motorcycle and you damage your clutch cover, that's probably quite easy to replace. It's got a little rubber seal, a little very big O-ring I suppose, so that's what keeps the oil in. So when the engine is running, the pistons are continuously going up and down in the engine of the motorcycle, and that means that the crankshaft is continuously rotating. So the crankshaft is just in here somewhere, goes through here and out the other side, and that is constantly rotating when the engine is running. Now we don't want the output shaft, which is just over here on the other side, just here where I'm tapping. It's on the other end of the clutch. We don't want the output shaft rotating constantly, because we want to be able to allow our motorcycle to come to a stop even when the engine is running. So the role of the clutch is to disengage the crankshaft from the or to disengage the output shaft from the crankshaft. So let's just see how that works. Let's remove these bolts. Let me see, I think they're at 10, are they? These are just 10mm. They shouldn't be too tight. Let me just loosen them all slowly. They should be about 10 Newton meters, so not very tight. Okay. Okay, so that's fully loose. And I'll try and keep these in order. Okay, so there you can see there's a little spring seat, spring retainer, which the bolt acts on, and that keeps the pressure on the spring. And here we have the lifting plate. So this out. Okay. So this is our clutch plaque. So the clutch is composed of this, the lifting plate. That's the lifting plate. And then we have a series of plates here. So we have 6 or 7 friction plates, and they mesh with the plane plates. So they alternate between a friction plate, plane plate, friction plate, plane plate. Okay? So as you can see, that makes up the clutch pack. And you can see that the friction plates, they have grooves on the outside of them, as you can see, and they mesh with the clutch basket. And then we can see that the plane plates, which is just the plain metal plates, they have grooves on the inside, and the grooves on the inside gel with the clutch center. So the clutch center and the clutch housing rotate independently of each other, as you can see, but they rotate together through this clutch pack because the friction plates are gelled, constantly rotating with the clutch housing, and the plane plates are rotating with the clutch center. And the way that it works is that these plates are gelled together. They act as one when they're under pressure. So when pressure is applied to them through the lifting plate and the pressure from the springs, that's what keeps the pressure on the clutch pack. But when you pull the lever on your clutch lever, what happens is this little lifter here, this little shaft, it's on the end of a shaft, it acts on the lifting plate, and it actually pushes the lifting plate. So it pushes the lifting plate this way, so this pushes this way, it acts on the lifting plate, and it takes the pressure off the clutch pack. And that, when there's no pressure on the clutch pack, the plane plates rotate with the clutch center, or stop rotating because they're no longer under friction with the friction plates. They're no longer under pressure, they're not stuck together, and the clutch housing is constantly rotating with the friction plates. Now the clutch housing is connected via a gear, which we'll see in a minute, to the crankshaft. So the clutch housing is always rotating with the crankshaft, but the clutch center, which is on the end of the input shaft, or is connected into the transmission, it only rotates when the plates are under pressure. So that's how the clutch works. Now let's take this out. We can see that there's a little washer in this inside here, which I want to show you. It's a little washer, so don't forget about that. Just one washer. You don't want to lose that when you're taking it out. You don't want to lose the order that the plates are in. You can just see that the friction plates are called friction plates because they are composed of this little, there's a friction material on it, special friction material. And that special friction material, that wears over time, and when that friction material wears, then the clutch doesn't function as it should. So we can take out this little lifter, okay. And it's on a little bearing, so it's little needle bearings here, okay. So that can rotate easily, and that just sits on top of this little washer, okay. So that's how that little lifter acts on the pressure plate. The clutch has a center nut, okay. Now the clutch has a center nut and it has a little washer, and it's a tabbed washer. So that means that this washer is stopping this nut from coming loose. So to get this nut off, we need to loosen up the tab in that washer. So we can do that. We can just use a little flathead screwdriver. That little tabbed washer just give it a little fine flathead screwdriver we get in. Okay, that gives me enough space to get in with another bigger flathead screwdriver. And I'm just going to lever it off the nut. So now I'm going to get a little punch. Okay, so our little tabbed washer is now flat. And this little bolt or nut in the centre, I think it's meant to be about 50 Newton meters. As you can see, it is not 50 Newton meters, it is very loose. So that's the whole point of this washer. Okay, so I'll put that back on that way, the way it's meant to go. Off comes my little tabbed, it's a trussed washer, so it has little grooves. That means that it fits onto this clutch, like so. So it fits back on a special way, so I'll just take that off. Okay, and now we can remove the clutch center. So there's our clutch center. Here's where the bolts all screw into. Okay, the last bit to come out is the clutch housing. So that's our clutch housing. And our clutch housing, on the back of it, we have the gear, this large gear, which has springs in it, and this is to gel, this gear gels with the gear from this is the main driven gear, And then we can see just here we have the main drive gear, which is on the end of the crankshaft. So let's put that down just for a second. We might use that. We can remove the crankcase cover. Now the crankcase cover contains the water pump. So this is the water pump. You can't just take the water pump straight off like that. The reason being that there is actually a gear on the other side which secures which means that you could loosen it up, but it won't come off fully because of the gear on the other side, which is stuck inside the crankcase. So to remove the water pump, you have to remove the whole crankcase cover. Now this bolt here is called the drain bolt. So this is where you drain the coolant. When you want to change the coolant on your motorcycle, you can drain the coolant here. This little drain bolt, just open it up. I think it's a 10. The coolant actually flows in this way. So the coolant flows into the water pump, and the coolant is then pumped through the engine. So it's pumped into the engine, through the engine, and then it comes out. It comes out somewhere around here. What we're going to do is we are going to loosen the remaining nuts or bolts that are securing on the crankcase. So we'll start off the ones up here at the top. Again, they shouldn't be too tight, so we can just go slowly. Okay, so I can just use my drill to remove the remaining bolts. They're now nice and loose. Okay, so that should be it. Try this one just in case. Okay, so it's coming loose there now. There we go. Okay. So there is our crankcase cover. Here you can see where the coolant, I think, flows into the engine. So we have a little bit of fluid left in the, it's flowing out this way. Get it out. Clean that up. It makes a mess. Some of that residual oil. Okay, so here we have our crankcase cover. Here you can see the gear that drives the water pump. Okay, So this little water pump is driven by this little gear here. It's just made from a little, looks like a plastic, made from plastic. Okay, and it is driven by this little gear here, which is on the end of the crankshaft. Okay, so then here we have the main gear, which connects in with this is the main drive gear on the end of the crankshaft, and this connects into the gear, the main driven gear behind the clutch basket. Okay, so let's just try and insert this. So as you can see, these two gears, they gel together. Okay, and this is the input shaft into the gearbox. Now here we have the gasket. As you can see, there's a little bit of white sealant around the which corresponds with the where the coolant flows out or is pumped out. The coolant is pumped out from here and here from the water pump. It's pumped into the engine here and in here, and there it goes around the cylinders of the engine and cools down. It's the water bath that cools down the cylinders of the engine. The other thing we can see on the crankshaft or crankcase cover is this gully here, and this is where some of the oil flows. So that's what that is for. Here we have the gasket that goes on the crankcase. Okay, as you can see, there is also two dowels, two small dowels here. We can remove this gasket. It's of no use. It can't be reused, so we can just tear that off. So it's just a paper gasket. Okay, with those two little screws out, I can now separate the water pump. So there's our water pump. And you can see it's a very simple mechanism or device. It's just a little impeller. So that's your water pump. Okay, so it rotates in that shaft. It has a number of seals on it. Okay, so you can see here there is a seal. It slots on like that. It has a little rubber seal, and that's to stop the coolant flowing or leaking out of the pump through the seals. We can actually see down here there's a little pipe, little rubber pipe, and it leads into the water pump. So what that is for is it's for the fact that we have two seals in the water pump. So this first seal here, I think this one here, is an oil seal. So when it's installed in the crankcase of the engine, its job is to stop the oil leaking into the coolant. And then there's a second seal which you can't actually see here, but there's a second seal inside between this oil seal and the impeller, and that second seal is a coolant seal, and its job is to keep the coolant from leaking into the oil. Now if either of those two seals fail, what you will notice is that either the coolant or the oil or both will come pouring out here. So there is a little sort of a safety mechanism or a safety area, so if there's leaks in either of the seals, instead of oil contaminating coolant or coolant contaminating the oil system, they actually leak out through here. So and that's installed in the engine. This is actually, you can't really see it that well, it's kind of covered up behind this lip, but it's actually outside of the crankcase of the engine, and you will see coolant or oil leak here. So the next component we can see here is the oil pump. So the oil pump is driven by this gear, and it interacts, pretty sure, with this gear here. Let me get it back in. Okay, so as you can see, the oil pump gear is driven by this gear, which is on the end of the input shaft. Now again, this clutch basket is always rotating because it's interacting, or it's connected up with the crankshaft gear, or the main drive gear, which acts on the main driven gear on the clutch basket. So this is always rotating when the engine is running. That means that the oil pump gear is always rotating, and it's always pumping oil around the engine. So the oil has to be pumped around the engine to keep it lubricated, keep things like the cams up and above in the cylinder head. They all have to be lubricated, all the gears have to be lubricated, any metal or moving part has to be basically lubricated inside the engine. So this gear, I can see a little bit of wear in it. I can see a little bit of a stress fracture. What looks like a stress fracture. So let's take off this little circlip first of all. Okay, just a little circlip, it holds it on, and then it slides off like so. Again, it has this little pin on the back of it, which slots in here, and that's what keeps the gear turning the shaft. So here's the shaft, and in here I think we probably have a trochoid oil pump. I've done a separate video on how a trochoid oil pump works if you want to take a look, but we can open this up. It's held on the pump, we can take it off. There's just 3 little screws here. Okay, so I'm going to leave that on for the moment. The next thing we can take a look at here is the gear change mechanism. So the gear change mechanism is the shaft. Now it acts on the shift drum, which is here. So behind here is the shift drum. This is the end of the shift drum, and the shift drum acts on, it is what rotates this little, it's just basically a little metal drum with little grooves in it, and as it rotates it changes the gears. Okay, so the gear mechanism goes this way, so that's probably put it into, I think, first gear. Okay, so now let me see, we can see that the input shaft, this is the input shaft connected to the clutch, and this here is the output shaft. This is the end of the output shaft. I'm touching on it here, and this is where the front sprocket is screwed onto on this side, on the front or the rear left hand side of the engine. So you can see that these two shafts they're connected up, and when I turn the input shaft, the output shaft rotates as well. So hopefully you can see that. You can see it's on the bearing. Okay, so they're sitting on bearings in the crankcase. Now if I go back again this way, I should have put it back into neutral gear, I think. Let me see. No, it's probably in second gear now. So let's go back again. Let's come back to first gear. So neutral is a little harder to find. And I'm not finding it very well, but let me try it again. Sorry, this was first gear, probably. I think that was first gear because it's not rotating again. So let's just try shifting it up. Okay, so there we have, we're back in neutral now. So we've shifted into neutral because when I turn the input shaft, the output shaft is not really rotating. The next bit that I can open up is I can take off this little bolt here, which holds on the cam chain guide. Okay, so this is the one that isn't removable. So I can actually, it is removable, but I have to remove that bolt. So let's go ahead and remove that bolt. Okay, so do that bolt. It's not too tight. Washer, which goes on the other side, goes in like that, on the other side of the, okay, and my little cam chain guide can come out. So again, it's just made from plastic, special type of plastic. And that's the bolt that holds it on, and the little washer. So to remove this gear, I need to remove this nut or bolt. So on this end of the crankshaft, there is this nut or bolt, and then on the other end of the crankshaft, we have, through the alternator cover, we have that bolt. That is on the other side. What's this? This is my 17. I need to put that on the end of the alternator so to keep it from rotating. And I think I need it's a 14, I think, on the end of this. Taking my breaker bar. Now this bolt actually has to be turned clockwise to loosen it. So I need to push this way, push that way, okay? Rather than with all the other bolts I would pull this way, counterclockwise. Now this one is, it's on, I think it's 70 Newton meters. So this is quite tight, this bolt. Now the bolt on the other side is 120, something like that, or 130 Newton meters. So this one should not move. So let's try and open it up. Okay, that's that nut loosened. So as you can see, it's screwing out clockwise. So that's that nut out. Okay, so there may be a little washer on the inside. Okay, but we can slide out this little gear, which I think that one acts on the water pump, and then slide out the main gear from the crankshaft. Okay, noting the way that they go, and then here we can see where the cam chain is driven by the crankshaft. So it sits on the end of the inner gear. So we can take that off. And there's our cam chain. Looks like it's in good condition. change the gear change, or to remove the gear change mechanism shaft, there is a little little washer here that I have to remove. Little circlip. Okay, there we go. So remove that little circlip. It's actually very hard to see because it's covered in so much dirt, but there should be a little washer, a little flat washer as well, and that should come out. Put them two together. Okay, so now you can see that the gear change mechanism shaft is free to move back around. Let's take a look at this. On the other side, here we have our gear change mechanism, okay, which we looked at, which acts on the shift drum. So I can just pull that out, just come around. So, gear change mechanism shaft should just pull out, okay, and that's it. The shaft, there might be a little washer here, okay, just one washer. Put that back on the end of it, and there's our gear change mechanism shaft. There's little poles, it's spring mounted. We can also remove the oil pump here, so I've loosened the bolts. We can show you that. We can note which way it goes back in as well. Okay, again, use a JIS, standard JIS PH 3X150 screwdriver, and my oil pump should just come out like so. Screw that little, there we go. There's our oil pump. Okay, as you can see, there is a little trochoid oil pump in here. So if I turn that, you can see the little trochoid oil pump. There's two little star-shaped pieces of metal. One star-shaped piece of metal fits inside another oddly shaped star piece of metal, and it actually acts as a pump. So we can now turn our attention to the other side of the engine, the left-hand side. So again, this is the front, this is the rear of the engine. This is our output shaft. This is our clutch push rod. And again, this is our alternator cover. So we've already taken that cap off, and that's how we were rotating the crankshaft. So this is the bolt here. If I can see through this opening, is the crankshaft. Now, to remove the alternator cover, I just have already loosened up these bolts. I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bolts that they're not too tight. They can all just be loosened up. So I'm going to take them off and stick them on a piece of cardboard so that I don't lose them. I have this marked up, left and right, and I have it marked that this is the Stator cover. And then one more. Okay, so at that I can now remove the Stator cover. There is probably little dowels like this, so they're the only things that really should be causing any resistance, and it might be one more shaft that I might be connected onto, so it just might be a little bit hard to get off. Okay, it's coming off there now. There we go. Okay, so that's our alternator, and it has a little cable coming out from it. So there's our alternator. The alternator is made up of two components. There is the Stator, which is this copper coloured coils of wire all wound up, and then we have our rotor. So the rotor is a magnet, so I can stick this in here, this piece of metal, and it's able to hold it up just due to magnetic force. Okay, same as the magnets, fridge magnets, basically very similar. It's magnets the whole way around. Okay, so they're stuck inside this rotor, which is just a metal bowl essentially. Now what happens is, when the engine is running, the rotor is rotating because it's on the end of the crankshaft. So as you can see, it is rotating, and as it rotates, the magnetic field is rotating with it, and the Stator sits in the middle here of the rotor, and the magnetic field acts on the coils of copper wire, copper being the best conductor of the naturally occurring metals. It's a very good conductor of electricity and heat, so the moving magnetic field acts on the coils of wire, and it induces current to be generated in the coils, and connected into the coils of wire we have this lead here. So you can't really see it too easily, but down in here we have the corresponding pieces of wire. It's probably these three black wires. So there's this little connector here. It has three little black wires. It's a three-phase alternator. It means that there's probably, on Honda motorcycles it's usually yellow, and this Suzuki SV650 it's black, but these three wires are probably connected up to the Stator. Okay, and basically we get an alternating current generated in the Stator, or in the alternator, which is the two components together form the alternator, and there's an alternating current, three-phase alternating current generated, comes up through this wire, and this is connected into your regulator rectifier, which is then connected on to the battery, and this generates the power, the current to the battery, which actually drives the electrics of the motorcycle and the ignition system, and it also recharges the battery. So that's the Stator. We have a little pickup here, so it's probably this black and white, or green and white connector. This is connected up, I can see green and white connected in here. It's connected up to this little pickup. So this little pickup is a little, I'll demonstrate it as well. So it actually is a little magnet. If I hover this screwdriver near it, it actually pulls it towards it when it gets close enough. You felt it there. You can feel a little bit of a force. This little pickup, or this little magnet, it too, it sits on the outside of the rotor, and we can see on the outside of the rotor there is these little metal protrusions. So these little metal protrusions are the whole way around the rotor, and they actually pass by that little pickup coil, and as they pass by they induce a current or a voltage which flows to the engine management system, and depending on how fast, essentially, the faster the engine is running, the faster the crankshaft is rotating, and then the faster that these little metal protrusions are passing by the pickup, and that increases the frequency of those pulses in the pickup coil getting passed to the engine management system, and that plays on the ignition system. So I won't go into the exact physics of how that works, but just so you know what those little protrusions are for, they probably help the timing of the advance on the engine or the ignition. So I won't go into any more detail than that. We then have this little shaft which came out. Okay, so let me take this little shaft here. So this little shaft actually fits in here. Let me see. Okay, there it is back in properly. Okay, so the components that we can see behind the rotor and to the left of the rotor, first of all we have the starter motor. So here we have the starter motor. Okay, so it is usually connected up to the positive terminal of the battery. The starter motor itself is grounded to the engine of the motorcycle. So it's grounded to the casing of the motorcycle, which is connected to the negative terminal of the battery. So once we supply power to the starter motor, there's a magnetic field, or there's magnets in the starter motor, and there's also coils of wire. So once the current flows through the coils of wire, it interacts with the magnetic field and it induces the motor to turn. So there's an output shaft from the starter motor which connects into the engine just here underneath this part of the crankcase. So we can actually see it here, just in there. So we can see here that this is the gear, the output gear from the starter motor, and it connects into this rounded gear here. So it connects into this gear. So when the starter motor runs, the output gear acts on this gear here, this intermediate gear. Also on this intermediate gear is this gear here. So this rotation causes this gear rotating causes this gear in front of it, the smaller gear, to rotate as well, and it is gelled up, as you can see, with the starter clutch driven gear. So behind the rotor we have the starter clutch. So the starter clutch, when the starter motor is running and these gears are turning, they act on this starter motor driven gear and they cause it to turn anti-clockwise. So once it is turning anti-clockwise, the starter clutch actually, we will see it in a second, but it actually acts on the crankshaft and causes the crankshaft to rotate. Now when the crankshaft is rotating with the rotor, along with the rotor, it gets the engine started. Now once the engine is started, we no longer supply power to the starter motor, and the gear from the output gear from the starter motor stops turning, and in turn it stops acting or supplying power to the, or stops, it doesn't supply power to rotate the starter clutch driven gear. So the engine is still running, so as you can see, the rotor can rotate and the crankshaft can rotate independent of the starter clutch. But when the starter clutch is rotating, it actually grips the crankshaft. But once the engine is running, the driven gear stops rotating and the crankshaft keeps rotating and your engine runs as normal. So that's how the starter clutch works. So we'll see that in a minute. So to get at the starter clutch, I need to remove the rotor. So I need to loosen this large bolt here, which I've already done. This bolt is the most secure at around 120-130 Newton meters of force to loosen this bolt. That's what it should be tightened to. So it's very tight. It's probably the tightest bolt in the engine. So I had to use a breaker bar, and usually you would use a strap on the rotor to stop the rotor rotating. So you would need something to secure the rotor, and then you can break open the bolt. So once it's broken open, as it is, you can then loosen it up. There is a little washer on the end of that bolt, just to be aware. Put that to the side. The next thing that you need is this special tool. So it's a special, it looks like a big bolt, but it's a special tool for removing the rotors of Japanese motorcycles. This works on my VFR. It works on this SV650. I think I paid about €20 for it. So again, this rotor will be jammed on quite tight. You will not be able to remove it without using a tool like this. Okay, now I've already loosened it. You might even need a breaker bar to loosen this. This one was actually loose enough, so I used my shorter breaker bar to leverage into it, so it goes clockwise. So it screws in, and what happens is this tool actually, it screws into the rotor, but it pushes on the crankshaft and it pulls the rotor off the crankshaft. So as you can see, that's how it works. Now I don't need it anymore, so I can remove it. You only need it to break that lock. Okay, so just remove it. So off comes my rotor. So let's just do this slowly. Actually, what I need to do is I need to remove these bolts that are securing the rotor to the crankshaft. Okay, so off comes my rotor. Okay, so that's the rotor off. Here is my starter clutch. So I need to remove that little key. I think it's called a Woodrow key. So just there's that little piece of metal, the Woodrow key, which slots in here on the rotor. Okay, so it's a tight fit. It's not that easy to get out. You have to use a screwdriver. So I've got it out anyway. And I'll just leave that to the side for a second. So now I can slide off the starter clutch and the starter clutch driven gear. So let me see. Inside here we can see our cam chain for the front cylinder, the cam guide, so we can remove that. There's going to be a little washer behind that. So just watch out for that. Just a little washer. Okay. Again, these cam chain guides are made from plastic. So there's our cam chain guide with the little washer. Keep that together. Here's our cam chain, which again is attached to the crankshaft by this little splined gear. we can also take out the intermediate gears that act on the starter motor. So take that off, along with the little shaft that comes with it. We can take that off. Right. So now our crankshaft is beginning to look quite bare. Okay, so the next part that we can remove is the starter motor. So it's held on with 2 bolts, which I have loosened already. They shouldn't be too tight. They're only an 8mm. Okay. And there's this little fastener on the starter motor and the bolt at the top. Okay, so it's a short bolt, 2 short bolts. Now the only thing that should be holding the starter motor in place now is just that where it connects into the engine at the other side, so we should be able to wiggle it out. Okay, here it comes, there we go. So that's our starter motor. Okay, so I can see here the cause of the problem, what caused failure in this engine. It is the splines on the starter motor. So they replaced this engine because the splines on the starter motor have worn. So you can see them here. So it basically wasn't catching the starter clutch properly. Probably a common enough problem. So that's our starter motor. As you can see, that shaft rotates. It has a little seal, an oil seal here, to keep the oil in the engine, and that's where it fits into the engine, just in there. So that's our starter motor. Put that to the side. So the next component that I'm going to remove is the oil pressure sensor, or the oil pressure switch. So I'm just using an adjustable spanner here to remove that. Should be loose enough. So it just screws out of the engine. Okay, so that's it there. Looks quite basic. But its role is to basically report. It basically lights up a light on the dash if the oil pressure is not sufficient to pump the oil around the engine. So that's its role. So the next thing I'm going to take out is the clutch push rod. So remember, the clutch basket fitted on here, and then the push rod is on the other side. So when you pull the lever for the clutch, it acts on this little push rod. So I can actually, this push rod pushed on, I'm pushing this push rod into the engine on the other side, and it's acting on this little push rod. It's in actually 2 pieces. So this is it on the other side, okay? So I can push it back and I can push it forward. So that's how the pressure is released from the clutch pack using these little push rods. So I can just remove them, and I'm going to remove the push rod on the other side. So that's the push rod on the other side. Okay, so just they meet like this and they push back and forth. So we're getting very close to being able to separate the crankcases. There's just a few more components that I need to remove. I think mainly on the right hand side. So I'm going to remove this little cog here. It slides off the main shaft, or the main crankshaft, where the cam chain connects onto. So I'm just removing that from the crankshaft on the right hand side. Okay, the next thing I need to remove is I need to remove this screw which is securing in the oil spray shaft or oil spray pipe. So I can just withdraw that. So that's the oil spray pipe. Okay, so it's just a little pipe, the oil goes up and there's a number of little holes in it. So they were facing downwards. Okay, so when you're reinserting that, it probably slots into a particular area on the other side, which you have to get right. Okay, and it's held in place by this little screw. So I've already had loosened that screw. I don't think I really need to remove it fully, so I'll just remove that pipe. The next thing I need to do is I need to loosen the securing bolt that's holding on the cam to the end of the gear selector drum. So I've already started to loosen that. It's quite tight. And that's going out. And once this comes off, the cam will come away from the so that's that removed. That's that little bolt. Okay, we can take a look at our cam. We can notice once we take it off, it's in, we'll put it into neutral, okay, before we remove it. Okay, so it's in neutral now. So I had to put it into first gear to stop it rotating any further when I was trying to loosen that bolt. But in neutral, you'll notice that it's a star shaped, but there's one end of the star where it's a little bit, the shape is a little bit different. That indicates neutral. So I can just remove that. Now we have a little stopper. Okay, that little stopper. I don't think we need to remove that. But that's what we can note, that when we're putting that back on, the neutral we can put back on, make sure we put the neutral in the right area. Okay. So I need to remove this little securing plate. I think it's just a 10mm. It's held on with 2 or 3 bolts. There may have been a bolt there, but it wasn't on it when I got this engine. So out comes this little securing plate. The bolts back where they're meant to go. Okay, so there should be a little seal here. There we go. That's that little seal removed. Okay. So that's how that just slides on and off. It's better to just take that off. There is a little seal on the inside, a little O-ring seal, which you probably can't see that easily, but when you're putting that back on, that should be replaced. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is remove these 2 bolts here, which are securing on the oil baffle. Tight, so just be careful here. Okay, that's that one loose. There's two, so this little oil baffle comes off. Next up, we want to start removing or loosening the bolts that secure the crankcase halves together. So the crankcase is in two halves. There's the right half and the left half. Sorry, this is the left half and this is the right half. So we need to be able to separate them, but they're secured with a number of bolts. So on the left hand side we have I think 4 bolts. We have 1, 2, 3 and 4. So I need to start loosening them. I loosen them just a small bit at a time. Okay, that should be enough just to break it. And then the next one is just here. Okay, that's that one broken. That's loose. That is loose. That one is nice and loose. Okay. And that brings this little, I think it's an oil baffle as well. Okay. I'll put this piece to the side, making sure that there's nothing going to fall off. Looks all okay. So then we need 2 holes for our 2 bolts here. One, and then one at the top. This one comes with a little clip for presumably for a wiring harness. So there's our bolts off, I think. Right, so there should be nothing else holding on the crankcase on the left hand side. So let's turn it around. So then the next thing we need to do is start removing the bolts around the engine casing. So there's some around, smaller bolts around the edge. They're about an 8mm socket. And then we have 3 large bolts. This one here, we've one here, and we have one here. They have to be loosened up. They are torqued down very tightly, so I've already loosened those. So let's just remove those 3 bolts. So we have this one. We have 1, 2, second one here. It's 2. So these are 3 bolts removed. Okay, so let's start removing our smaller 8mm bolts now that those 3 larger bolts are removed. So we'll start off here. Okay, run cross pattern. Let's get a smaller extension. That's 3. Okay. 4. That's 5. Next one. Last one. Okay, they should all be loose now. Okay. And then we just have one little spacer here that comes off the where the clutch and the starter clutch reside. Before I separate the crankcase halves, I'm just going to remove the oil filter. Let's put Probably going to be a good bit of oil coming out from that, but that's the oil filter out. To separate the crankcase halves, you don't want to be hammering it with a steel hammer. What you need is sort of a rubber mallet or sort of a plastic head hammer. So I've done a good bit of tapping around, just light tapping, because the crankcase is made from aluminium, which is quite a soft metal, so it'll break, fracture quite easily. So I've just given it a few taps. I've found a few places, sort of lips, where you know you don't want to be digging into, you don't want to be coming in and doing this, tapping down like that. What you want to do is find a lip. There's one here, there's I think one or two here, small lips. So what I do is I just give it a few taps, light tapping like that, like so. Now once you break that sort of gasket seal, you can see that the crankcase is now loose. So that's what you're looking for. And that allows you to then just separate, just keep at it. It will come loose. You don't have to be too rough with it. Just move it up and down. Should be able to separate the crankcase halves now. Okay, so I'm lifting the left half of the crankcase off the right half. So I think generally you should lift it says the service manual instructs to lift the right side off the left, but I don't think it really matters a whole lot. So here we have the left side of the crankcase. That's it inside. It's quite bare. You can see there's a number of bearings. This is where the crankshaft fits. I think this is just holding on the bearing for the main bearing. We have some oil jets here, which are held on with a little fastener and a bolt. Here we have where the oil feeds into the oil filter, just in through here. There's a little seal on it. We then have this here is the oil pressure relief valve with a number of bearings again at the rear of the engine. This is where the selector drum sits in here. We have some slots for the fork holders, so they slot in here, and then we have little bearings for where the gearbox shafts. So this is the input shaft here bearing, and this is the main output bearing, or the output shaft bearing, okay, so which is here. So you can see it's quite a large bearing. The bearings for the output shaft and for the crankshaft are going to be quite large. And this is where the oil filter fits on. This is where our cylinders sit. They sit into the crankshaft here, and here. This is the front, and this is the rear. So apart from that, it's quite bare on the left-hand side of the crankcase. If you wanted to remove the main bearing, you would remove these two little screws and take off this holder, and then you would get the main bearing out if you wanted to replace that. Here we have the oil drain bolt just here, so you can see where it drains out of the engine just here, and that's the left crankcase half. Now, on the other side, here we have the crankshaft itself. So as you can see, here's the two connecting rods. And you can see it's able to rotate in the right half of the crankshaft. So it's still sitting in its main bearing on the right hand side. Okay, you can see that the connecting rods, you can undo those bolts and disconnect the connecting rods. The crankshaft has two counterweights. We have 1 and 2 here, so these are large counterweights. They can be removed, but you would generally not want to be removing those. You'd need a high pressure press to remove those, I would imagine. So that's like our crankshaft. This is where the pistons obviously sit, and this is the cylinder, the front cylinder, and this is the rear cylinder just here. Now we also have our transmission. So here is our transmission. I have it in neutral. So here's the output shaft. On the other side here I can touch the input shaft. So I can hold the input shaft. Am I seeing that? What gear is this in? I don't know. Okay. Let's try it there now. So now it's actually in neutral gear. So it's in neutral here. So you can see what I mean by constant mesh. The gears are constantly meshed up. Okay. So the input shaft and the output shaft, the gears are constantly meshed. You can see that even though I'm holding the input shaft and it's not moving, this shaft here is not moving, whereas the output shaft is moving. You can see that some of the gears are actually on the input shaft are actually moving with the output shaft. And similarly on the, some of the gears on the input shaft and output shaft are actually moving. Right, so they are engaged and constantly, and that's why it's called constant mesh gearing system. But they're not actually connected in properly to the shafts, so that's why the shafts are not, the output shaft is rotating whereas the input shaft is not rotating. So remember, the input shaft is connected to the clutch, the output shaft is connected to the front sprocket of your motorcycle. Now, to change gear, you act on, you press with your left foot to switch. You press the lever on the left side of the engine and it acts on this little thing here. It's called the selector drum. So it's in neutral at the moment. So if I want to put it into first gear, I think I just move it. I have to have it moving slightly. So let's see, is it in gear? So now it's in first gear. So I've shifted it. When you press that lever, it shifts this shift drum. Okay, so this drum has a number of grooves in it, and in these grooves are connected the guide pins that are connected to the shift fork. So we have one shift fork, we have two on this shaft here. So we have two shift forks on the forks that are connected to the output shaft, and we have one shift fork connected to the input shaft. Right, so it's meshed in with the input shaft. So as this shift drum moves, the guide pins on each of the forks moves in the little grooves. So as you can see, as this rotates, let's see if we can get you can see this shift, you can see this fork here. When I shift the drum, let me just rotate it again, you can see that it moves down, and I'm going to move it back up. So I rotate it into first gear. No, sorry, it's not first gear. But as you can see, it shifts that fork. So the fork slides up and down, and that fork is intermeshed with the gears on the input and the output shaft. So that moves the gears up and down the input shaft and the output shaft, and depending on how they're meshed up, depending on how those gears are meshed, it kind of determines what gear the engine is in. So I can actually pull this out. I'm not going to undo this gearbox. but that's the gearbox, that's how the transmission works. It's very simple. It's an input shaft, an output shaft, a shift drum, 3 shift forks, guide pins, and they're moving up and down on these 2 shafts here. Okay, these just guide shafts. Now the other thing we have here is the oil strainer. It's underneath this little cover, so we can take that off. Now you can't get at this oil strainer unless the crankcase halves are separated. So you undo those 2 bolts, take off this little cover, and here we have the oil strainer. So you can't get at it. What you can do is you can remove this little bolt, and you can actually drain any sludge or dirt that is built up here. We have a little seal here, little irregular shaped oil seal. We probably have some jets as well, some oil jets on this side that are very similar to on this side. And that's really it. That is inside the crankcase of the engine of an SV650. It's very simple, as you can see. It's really not that complicated. So that is it. That is the end of the video. Hopefully you've enjoyed that and you've taken something from it, and you can now understand how the engine works on your own SV650. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and we'll chat to you again soon.